Okay, for real. If you want to know why I started this podcast, then stick around. My name is Julie Deem, and this is Not Your Mom's Sales Podcast. This might be our first episode of Not Your Mom's Sales Podcast, but it is not my first time recording a podcast episode. For those of you who don't know, I co host the podcast United State of Women, and it's a leadership development podcast that launched in 2019. I've been really into podcasting for a little while now. And when I decided to start a podcast in 2019, I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew that it was something I wanted to do. The backstory is I attended a brunch here locally in Kokomo, Indiana. And through that brunch, I joined the marketing team. And through the marketing team, I pitched the idea of starting United State of Women podcast. That show now has over 200 episodes, and it has been the catalyst for how I have gained the podcast experiencing and where I am in the podcasting industry today. Fast forward in 2020, I started the Business Podcast Editor. This was a business that I launched online during the pandemic because my career as a massage therapist was put on the shelf. I wasn't able to actually do massage, which I had been doing since 2005. And I didn't know what else to do. So I took my skills as a podcaster and I started to offer to produce podcasts for other women who were speaking professionally but had not yet launched a podcast because of the barrier around the technology. Apparently, podcast editing at the time was something that overwhelmed people. And I was grateful that I could provide the support to help get shows launched, to help raise women's voices in the podcast world. Because at the time in 2020, women made up a quarter of the podcast industry. And so it's exciting to see more and more women come along and start their own podcasts to create their own influence in the world and in their markets, which is one of the biggest passions that I have for myself as someone who has stepped into leadership development and spends a lot of time volunteering in youth mentorship and serving in my own community. I really appreciate any opportunity to help somebody else and really just encourage them along the way. When I started the business podcast editor, I had to set myself apart and I really started taking my own skills and applying them in different ways. And I leveraged those opportunities with the podcast that I was already hosting. Being somebody that already had a podcast, I was able to use that experience to get more speaking engagements and get more connections and more relationships that could help me reach more people to really help build my own business. And that's where we come to today. Since then, I have spoken at PodFest conferences, online virtual conferences, mastermind groups, and I've been invited to host our United States of Women podcast at many events like the annual Global Leadership Summit. Our our community of Kokomo, Indiana, they host a satellite summit here, and we get to host our podcast at that summit every year. As I've seen the market change, I've realized that people are still having a hard time wrapping their head around like how people can use a podcast to make money. And that's where this Not Your Mom's Sales podcast comes into play. I created this podcast for listeners like you because you might be feeling a little overwhelmed at the idea of starting a podcast. Or if you already have a podcast, you might be feeling a little discouraged at the amount of time you're putting into it. Having a show like this to encourage you and walk alongside you to provide the support to remind you that what you're doing does matter and keep you going, it's my biggest mission. I'll be here every episode. Please reach out to me directly. Please send me a voice message, whatever you want to do, because this is a show that I've created just to serve you, to help you maximize your influence through the podcast that you currently host. So I hope you'll join me every week. New episodes will come out on Friday, and you can follow along at thebusinesspodcasteditor.com for more resources and other ways to connect with me. Thank you for listening to this episode of Not Your Mom's Sales Podcast, where we share the latest sales and marketing strategies for you to leverage with your podcast. My name is Julie Deem, and you can schedule a complimentary discovery call to find out if podcasting is a good fit for you. I would love to connect with you on Instagram at Julie Deem, and, of course, to learn more about how you can work with me, visit thebusinesspodcasteditor.com. New episodes release on Fridays. Until then, keep growing.